All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. So thanks everyone for joining us, and welcome to today's webinar on proposal writing, management, and budget planning. The webinar is co-sponsored by the Consortium for Ocean Leadership through our Marine Geosciences Leadership Symposium, and also the Center for Dark Energy Biosphere Investigations, or C-DEBI. I'm Kristen Urincic. I'm the Vice President for Research and Education Programs at the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. If you don't know about COL, as we're called, we're a member organization, and our members are probably many of your institutions, university departments, and other research institutions in ocean sciences. Also, with us today, as kind of co-leading this webinar with me, is Stephanie Schroeder from C-DEBI, and I'll give her a minute to introduce herself. Stephanie?
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Schroeder. I am the Education Outreach and Diversity Managing Director of C-DEBI. Yes, and we're looking forward to this collaboration. Thank you.
Great. So a little bit about the agenda. We have Dr. Donna Blackmon, and she'll speak about the management aspects of proposal preparation, including preparing your timelines and organizing and managing a research proposal, managing your research. And then we're going to hear from Beth Orkett, who will provide advice on scoping and preparing a budget for a research proposal. And then at the end, we plan to have plenty of time for your questions. Okay, next slide. So the Consortium for Ocean Leadership provides professional development programs. One of these is our Marine Geosciences Leadership Symposium, which was undertaken over the past, I think, about 5 or no, probably more like 10 years, or not 7 or 10 years at this point, with funding from NSF. MGLS was a biannual workshop for early career marine geoscientists, and we focused on developing communication and leadership skills, discussing aspects of collaborative research and funding, and providing training on how to write effective proposals. We are currently scoping what a new program or follow-on program to MGLS might look like, and we'd like to keep all of you in the loop on that as we move forward. So thanks for providing that information on your registration. So now I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie to talk a little bit more about C-DEBI.
Great, thank you. For those who are unaware, C-DEBI is the Center for Dark Energy Biosphere Investigations. We are an NSF-funded science and technology center. Our research focuses on life below the seafloor. The component that I am in charge of is the education outreach and diversity. So I also, we run a professional development program for our graduate students and early career scientists to provide some transferable skills that aren't necessarily taught in the research world. So as part of that series, we have a professional development webinar series that focuses on targeting skills that are both necessary in and out of academia. We have this webinar series every other month. Our next one is August 24th, and that will be Dr. Karen Lloyd talking about job negotiation. I will put my email in the chat box. We also have, in addition to our newsletter, we have a mailing list for graduate students, postdocs, and early career scientists, where I send out very specific announcements about outreach or funding sources or the webinar series. And any further questions about C-DEBI, please send me an email. Now I'm going to talk about just some reminders and tips for the webinar. Please mute your microphone or phone if you are not speaking, so we don't have any feedback. And at any time, please enter your questions into the chat box. We're going to reserve the Q&A session for the end, but we've allotted time so that participants can ask the speakers either via the chat box or with the audio. And to reduce feedback, please have only one person speak at a time. And also this webinar will be recorded and available after the live version. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to get right into it. Our first speaker is Donna Blackmon. Donna is a research geophysicist at the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is part of the University of California, San Diego. Donna has also served as a program director at the National Science Foundation in the Marine Geology and Geophysics program. Donna's research primarily focuses on tectonic and magmatic processes that occur along ridge-transform plate boundaries. She frequently employs a variety of geophysical methods, seafloor mapping and sampling, and ocean floor drilling in her work, and has also used hydroacoustics to study long-distance sound propagation in the oceans to document the capabilities of international networks designed for nuclear test monitoring. Donna holds a BS from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and an MS from the MIT Hui Joint Program, and a PhD from Brown University. Thanks, Donna.
Okay, thank you, Kristen, and pleasure to see or hear or be connected with all of you that are attending today. As Kristen just mentioned, the majority of my career is being an active research scientist. And so that's a lot of, majority of my experience in proposal writing will draw on that. But having seen a few things from the rotation that I did at NSF for 3 years, I'll bring a few of those things to bear, and just some of the details about forms and fast lane that may not be obvious from the outside, but in fact actually matter quite a bit to the program manager who's handling the proposal that you do submit. So let's dig in. I'm gonna talk fairly generally about proposal writing, but a number of the things that I'll spend a little bit more time on, because I think that those are the places where sometimes things aren't always obvious, is what about when you're doing a collaborative proposal? It's a team of you. It's not just you by yourself, because that's where some of the more complex and time-consuming parts of proposal writing come in, at least in my experience. So the sort of breaking it down to the bare bones part of what's involved, what are the aspects that we need to consider? First of all, the proposal needs to be defined, and you need to define that fairly clearly. The clearer you can define what your study is about, the easier everything else is going to be. What are the data requirements for this study? And we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail, so we'll just give an overview at the moment. Once you have the data in hand, or perhaps while you're acquiring the data, what are the analyses that are going to need to be done? How complex or straightforward are those? Are they interdependent? Okay, now that you've sort of outlined what it is you want to do, what's going to be involved, what is the expertise you need? And then we'll talk about, okay, do you have all of that expertise, or do you need to be bringing in other people, and thus you're talking about a collaborative proposal, and what are the different levels of how linked in, how connected you need people to be for that. And then some of the nuts and bolts of proposal preparation. And of course, I'll be handing off to Beth, who will cover the budget preparation in quite a bit of detail, so I won't spend time on that. Okay. So, oops, here I am trying to move the thing forward. Okay, and just stepping back, I will come back towards the end of the presentation here, and I will talk about sort of what I've found to be the approximate amounts of times that it takes to do this. How far ahead of when you want to submit your proposal should you begin, and how do you go about managing the writing tasks? But it really does, the numbers for those things, how long it's going to take, what sort of management activities you might consider while you're putting it together. It really does depend on how complex it is. So first I'm going to go over some of the aspects, the first 3 aspects, and then we'll come back to the time frame. So defining the study, what it comes down to, what are you going to do, and why is it interesting? Always keep that in sight, try and be real clear in your mind. What is it that you're going to do and why? What's the aim of the research, and what do you expect the outcomes to be? You can step back, there's no one right answer to this second point here, but will your study provide a complete answer to a specific question? Or perhaps you're working on a sort of broader problem and you're going to address specific aspects. it can often be very helpful to recognize which type of approach your study is going to be. If you're really going to try and be pretty complete and fully answer a question, you want to be very cut and dried about that. If you're going to be making advances in a particular area, you're going to need to spend some time providing the context and what that broader problem's about, but be realistic about the fact, okay, this is an important overall problem to solve, but I can only really make good progress in a 3-year, say, time period on this or these 2 aspects, and have that clear in your mind. Be upfront with reviewers about that. Is this the type of study that has the opportunity or the potential to change thinking in the field in a major way? There's a lot of excitement when you have a sort of, quote, transformative type of study, but it's fine if you don't. But if you do think you have one, play it up. Make that clear to people and indicate why it is that you think that this potential does exist and why your approach is going to be an auspicious way that you think might be successful. Or are you more in the mode where you're there's this, as I was talking about before, sort of an ongoing problem that the community's been working on for a while, and you've identified a very specific gap that if that knowledge was available, then the rest of the study could go forward, and framing your proposal as that can be very effective and compelling as well. So you've kind of laid out what it is you want to do and why, what you think the outcomes are. Step back a little bit early on is my suggestion here, and think about, okay, is this a study that I'm doing just, curiosity driven science, what science is about? Or is it a study, or perhaps, and it's a study that actually has a fairly applied outcome? There is perhaps some civilian application, or maybe you're going to address a hazard or something like that. If that's the case, early on, think about, okay, ultimately down the line, some of the outcomes of my study might benefit these stakeholders. Think about what it is that they would actually need to apply what the knowledge that you've developed is. Now, you may not actually be putting all the pieces together so that the outcome will be in the format they need at the end of your study. But if you understand what type of format would eventually be needed, you can tune how your outcomes are a little bit better. And this becomes really important because in the broader impact side, many of us, myself included, we tend to take this tack and, say for me, I'm working on some earthquake studies or something. And I say, oh, it has a societally relevant outcome for hazard. But if what I'm studying is too far removed from somebody at the USGS being able to say, okay, I can take Blackmon's result and turn it into a hazard map, I need to sort of help show how at least somebody in the middle would be able to take my results and make that connection. Otherwise, I'm really kind of just waving my arms about the broader impacts. And though it may be true, it's not going to be a high impact, broader impact. And so trying to connect some of those dots to ultimate use when you do have an applied outcome can be very helpful. And it helps your thinking too sometimes. Maybe I might do something slightly different in my study that would allow me to, in fact, address that, what that policymaker is going to need to know. So think through some of these things early on as you're defining the study, not at the end, not as you're writing that last paragraph about broader impacts. Okay, data requirements. It's really creative. Now, some of you may not be collecting new data, but let's go ahead. All of you may want to think about, should I collect new data? If you're going to propose to collect new data, really make it clear why. Why is that new data needed? What questions can only be answered if there's new data? Versus perhaps there's a scenario where there's actually a fair amount of data out there in the community and you might be better off and it might cost a lot less money if you were to synthesize some existing results and you could still have a very good study. But particularly for those of us, I know a number of you are seagoing scientists, those are expensively acquired data. Some particular lab data are quite expensive. Program managers are going to be looking at that. Reviewers are going to be looking at that. So really be quite clear in your mind about what is it that this new data is so crucial for. Then is there special equipment that's required? And this is you're going through these questions early on because you're trying to figure out how far ahead of time do I need to start working on this proposal? When should I submit the proposal if I want to do the work 2 years from now? And these are things that, if you're having special equipment, very key. You need to have a sense of when might I first get access to that equipment. What sort of application or approval steps are there? And so we'll go into a little bit of detail on one example of that in a couple of minutes. But having some sense, you don't want to develop this beautiful proposal, submit it, and then find out, wow, okay, it's only going to be 5 years from now before I can even start the study. Now, you may still want to do that, but you better be writing some other proposals in the meantime. So you need to be aware of kind of the whole scope of what's involved. Are there permits required to do the work? Perhaps you're working on live subjects. Perhaps there's environmental concerns out in the study area. Maybe you need to have access to international waters, or you're actually working in international. You'll need to find out ahead of time what sort of permits are required. If you're working in international areas, find out what the data sharing requirements are. There, in my experience for seagoing stuff, almost all the data you collect is required to be shared at least at some level, maybe just the raw level, with those international hosts of the region. So be aware of those, and there may be some coordination activities that should be going on with that, depending on who is in that other country that might have access to the data that you've created. A helpful thing can be if the study that you're doing is particularly timely. Maybe there's some natural event that just happened and you're trying to follow up on it and kind of document the evolution. So that would be an obvious one. But perhaps there's something going on in the knowledge within the community. And you can you feel like, wow, I'm positioned. I can just bring these two pieces together if we were to be able to carry out this study now. Play that kind of stuff up. Because one of the things that happens when, at the stage of panel review of proposals, so program managers are trying to get input from kind of a broad view of the community with a panel. And then they have some sense of, okay, there's, say 70% of all the proposals we came in are really solid proposals. They merit funding, but we can only fund 25% of them. So one of the factors that comes into play as they're narrowing down how many they're actually going to be, which ones they're actually going to be able to fund is there a particular timeliness that if we don't do this now, we're going to miss this opportunity altogether? Or perhaps if we do this one study now, that could enable a whole nother, kind of the next step, the next suite of things. And so those are the kinds of things to be aware of. And if you are in that situation, play it up. Don't worry if you're not in that situation, that can still be a fine proposal. But in those cases, one of the sort of situations that you're in when you're already a good solid proposal, you're trying to stand out a little bit further than some others. And these are some of the ways that you can help yourself do that. Okay, at this stage, when you're just thinking about, okay, what data, or perhaps it's maybe modeling runs that you're going to do, think about the feasibility. You've posed this question. Can you actually feasibly cover perhaps the size of the region that you need to, or can you get down to the resolution you really need to answer the question you've posed? Think about that at this stage. After you've sort of designed your big question and then you've thought about your data requirements, come back, cycle back and say, oh, am I really doing this? Or am I only partly doing it? Partly might be okay, but you need to be upfront about that. All right, into the analysis requirements. Sorry, here I am trying to forward it myself. Okay, we talked a little bit about this, but okay, are you in a situation where you need specialized sample handling or a specialized laboratory or computing, and you'll need to basically line up your access to that? Is there a time sensitivity to whether it's perhaps some physical or chemical analysis, biological analysis in the laboratory? Is that time sensitivity because your sample is going to degrade, and so then it's really crucial, or perhaps it doesn't stand up to freezing or whatever? I'm sorry, I'm not a biologist, so I hope I'm not saying anything too nonsensical. Another thing that I really wanted to point out here, because it's something that sometimes not everybody thinks all the way through, is if you've got a team effort and different people are doing different analyses, is one part of the team going to be depending on the results from another part before they can really move forward in the best sense? And if so, you need to have that timing and coordination worked into your proposal from the start. And that's where this feasibility question comes up. Is there enough time for that first team to get far enough along in their work that they can hand off results that second part of the team can work, and actually complete the whole analysis within the 3 or 4 years of what your project is. So don't forget to think about that. And a very useful approach, not every proposal has to do this, but it can be very useful to just outline very explicitly what are the suite of parameters that are going to be explored. Maybe it's just one scenario, but most often we're testing models, which means we're looking at more than one scenario and trying to either disprove the possibility of one scenario or confirm the allowability of another. And then maybe we'd like to narrow the range of the allowable ones. So in trying to narrow the range of allowable explanations of our observation, what are the parameters that we're going to explore? Lay it out. And in going through these kinds of discussion, they're a little bit nuts and bolty, but when you've got a team, it can help each other understand the problem as a whole in a better way, and it can help communication a little bit to break it down in this kind of a way. In many studies, it's not unusual that the suite of parameters that you plan to explore evolves a little bit because you've learned something. Maybe you've been able to rule out one whole set of parameter space. And what I mean by parameter space, some pressure temperature combination, for example, perhaps some chemical combination. You can say, oh, wait, we've determined this is not relevant, so we've narrowed the space already. Or perhaps you actually part a new chemistry that you hadn't worried about before. You realize, oh wait, something else had to be going on, and it's probably this. So if there is a potential for it to evolve, that can be a useful thing to point out in a proposal, because it allows your reviewers to understand that you're really thinking about this in depth. You're kind of thinking through what might develop, and you have a sense of where you'll go if that does develop. And if you're kind of new in the field, and so not a lot of people have seen how you go about your science, this is one of the ways that you can give reviewers and program managers confidence that, yeah, you're ready to carry this ball. Really important, again, all of you guys have learned this. Some will have this more at the tips of their tongue than others. How are you going to assess uncertainties in your results? How good is good enough? How close are you going to come to good enough in what your results are? And that almost always is hard for me to think of a proposal that doesn't need to address that at least at some level. Now, this is something, those of you coming in, you're growing up with this. It was a newer thing for my generation. Where are the results going to be archived? You know, we are doing science. It's publicly funded science. Others should have access to material so that they could test our method and see if they come up with the same results. Or perhaps people want to build on our results. Where can they go to get to the archive of our results? And it might be a physical archive, might be a digital archive. There's no one right answer to that. It depends on your field. But it is something now with the requirement for data management that archiving has to be not only addressed in the data management, but who's going to carry it on, and is there enough time allotted in the project that they can do that well, so that it actually will be complete by the end of the project. Because at this time, I don't know how many of you have had a final report needing to be approved, but at the end of a funded project, the program manager has to sign off and approve a final report. And one aspect of that is the data management, which includes archiving. And a program manager could refuse to sign off, and then you would not be able to get funding on a next project if that would happen. The program manager, if they're doing their job well, should be holding your feet to the fire and saying, okay, the ideal is that your approach is actually archived. If it's not 100%, you ought to be 95% along the way at the end of that final report, and you ought to have outlined which final steps to get those last few samples that you just generated back into the archive as well. So this is actually, you really do need to address this. Software. Is there going to be some software development as part of your project? If so, you need to address who's going to do the proofing. How's it going to be proofed? Is it 3 lines of code and it's trivial, or perhaps it's 2,000 lines of code, and then you really need to do some sort of benchmarking. You need to talk about whether you're going to provide that code as open access. How, if you are you going to put it in a place in GitHub, or are you going to just post it on your website, which is typically, it's not disallowed, but it's not usually thought to be the most bomb-proof sort of way to provide code. So you need to talk about those things if there is going to be anything more than just a trivial software development. And again, coming back to this, is this all feasible? Okay, let's carry on. Now, we've kind of laid out the framework of what we're going to do. who do we need to do it? Perhaps it's something you can do all of yourself. Great. If so, dig in, you're ready to go. If not, there's some more things to think about. It may be a situation where you can do all the work yourself, but for some reason you recognize a benefit to collaboration. And that may be fine. The only point that I guess I want to bring up to you guys as early career people is collaboration is more complex. It will take more time. It will slow down your publication almost certainly. And so it's just something to think about. I don't want to discourage you from collaborating because that can be a really beneficial thing. But be clear about why you're collaborating and what the benefits of that collaboration are. Then, is your collaborator in the same institution with you or not? If not, there's going to be some additional steps in terms of coordinating, working with your contracts and grants office has to work with their contracts and grants office. And that the timing of that needs to work out for a collaborative proposal. With your partners, with your collaborators on the project, are you looking for true, somebody who's kind of with you at about the same level? So basically another project investigator? Or are you looking for somebody who's doing some specialized analysis? You don't necessarily expect them to take the lead on the interpretation of the data, but you need some very special and well done analysis. And perhaps they're providing advice for, in fact, how the analysis might proceed. That would be a senior personnel kind of situation. More often than not, that latter situation is going to be a sub-award rather than a collaborator. Depends on the complexity of what that specialized analysis is. But do look at that, and the expectations, and in fact how you write up, whether it's a literal collaborative proposal and so multiple institutions are submitting, or it's just a sub-award and there just needs to be a work statement from the sub-awardee. It can be a little bit simpler in the latter case, but you can end up accruing you can end up paying overhead twice in the sub-award case. So that's one of the reasons to consider collaboration. Okay, so you've kind of recognized you need more than you, perhaps, or maybe it's just you. At that stage is a good time to, okay, who all is going to be involved? Let's see if that, and talking to those other people, now you're in a position to hone the definition of the problem or defining the study a little bit more. Re-outline what those key questions are, how well you're going to address them with your particular study. Adjust the details of the data and analysis requirement, and then finalize the team. And at that state, at the point where you don't necessarily assume that everybody you're talking to is going to be on the final team, or at least it's usually a little bit risky to assume the first time you contact them that that's how it's going to go. It's best to approach it as, okay, I'm looking into this. I'd like to explore your interest and how you might contribute, and then have a stage that, okay, we've had these discussions. What we can see based on those discussions is this is who our team's going to be, and this is who's going to do what, and who's going to be the lead each part of that. And then at that stage, have in mind who's going to be keeping track of which tasks of data management and archiving. Okay, next. All right, we're ready. We've got the pieces. We've kind of had bits laid out a little bit, but now let's start thinking about the whole proposal. The lead PI plays a crucial role. Most things really aren't going to make much progress unless there is a single lead person. That person coordinates. Doesn't mean they do everything. There are scenarios when sometimes they do almost everything, but for a fairly complex project, it's most typical that the lead does the coordination and they identify writers of specific sections, because rather than, I might be a lead, but I don't have a lot of detailed expertise. I don't have any detailed expertise in biology, and yet that's part of my project. Well, I'm going to point to Beth and say, geez, could you take the lead on that section and hand off, because she's going to be she's going to write a better section. It's going to be better honed. She's going to be faster at it because she has the references are all in her head. The key thing if you're going to be handing off section writing to other people, set a time frame. Let them know what your expectations are. Back out, and we'll come in just another slide to what the overall time frame is. But think, at the point, let's call it a month ahead of when the proposal is due. And we've had enough discussions that we can really see the sections and the subsections of the proposal. And now I'm assigning, I'm saying, hey, okay, I think A is going to do this section, B is going to do that section. And I want to have outlines, perhaps, is a way to start. I want to have outlines at the end of this week, and we're aiming for first drafts at the end of 2 weeks from now. Lay out those expected dates really quickly. I usually try and get the outline within a couple of days, and then you adjust from there. And you have human beings that have busy schedules that you're working with. Some of them are going to make your time frame and some of them aren't. And you're going to have to figure out, how do I deal with this? Different, it's every team I've ever worked with. There's individuals and we all behave a little bit differently. So don't expect everybody to hold to your time frame, but do your best to keep them not too far from it. Okay, you need to be aware at the point where you're digging down and you're writing actual words. Do go in, it might be, if this is not a one-time call for proposals, if it's sort of an annual call or maybe a biannual call, go in and look to make sure you're following the latest call, because sometimes there are often updates year to year for certain programs, and you need to make sure you're not addressing some objective that in fact doesn't exist anymore. Do check for some special programs, not for the core programs usually. There's some very specific requirements, and you will be non-compliant is the term that's used if you have not met those, and your proposal won't even get considered. So look to the specific program call, make sure you're looking at the latest one. And then the next step is to go to the grant proposal guide, which is where all the details of the format of the proposal, things like font size, things like margins and stuff like that, that in fact you will have to follow. You will get booted out if you don't. Often on a little formatting thing, they'll give you about a week to fix it, but they don't have to. Some certain programs will just right away throw you out. It's worse in engineering, but just be aware that it can happen. So you do need to look. And again, similar to the program calls and even more often, the grant proposal guide does get updated periodically. So make sure you've checked the latest version, and it's online with that. The link is provided there. If it's a large and complex study, you do need to get in touch with the program director for the program. Most programs say this is a requirement. That those of us, when you're not at NSF, you might read the wording and you might not realize it's a requirement, but it's intended to be that you really do need to talk with them. If you're coming into a program where most programs are 350,000, maybe 400,000 a year, but you think you've put together a kind of team approach that makes good scientific sense and makes much more sense to do it this way as an integrated project rather than 3 separate projects, but your budget's going to be almost $1 million. You need to talk with your program director, and they can give you some advice as to whether, 1, they'll accept it, 2, how might you approach that in a way to frame it that will work. Okay, deal with the facilities request, and we'll look very briefly at a ship time request just in a moment. And it's at that stage, particularly for seagoing things, but any field going things, where you need to start thinking about the logistics. Okay, where am I going to start this project from? Are there limitations in terms of weather in this area? Are there, if you're at sea, is this a particular part of the world where there's piracy concerns? And in fact, you really need to ask ahead of time, can I even work here? Because the answer, in a very small number, but it's not 0, it's that you cannot work there in this particular 5-year period of time. So do be aware that those kind of situations, you need to look into that. Okay, and then I'll talk that information will go in, be submitted as supplementary material. And then all of these things, all of your materials, the various different sections are going to be submitted to FastLane. And each institution in a collaborative proposal has to do separate FastLane submissions. There's a lead institution that has to link these things, and nothing can happen until everybody's piece is in. And so one institution lagging can bring the whole thing down, because the lead can't proceed if somebody who's linked has not gotten their stuff in. So it's a job to keep ahead of this all. And then this slide, before we leave it, I do want to mention that it's often a good idea, particularly if you're doing something in kind of an innovative or relatively new part of the field, is to take advantage of the fact that you can provide suggestions for reviewers, well-informed people that the program manager might not be aware of or might not think of. You don't want to put every possible reviewer in there, because it's most typical that a program manager will want to choose 1 or 2 of their own. But if it is a new field that's kind of just breaking open, and maybe there's not so much familiarity with who's working on this and who actually could provide good advice, that reviewer suggestion that you provide as a single copy document, and single copy document is a particular phrasing that exists in FastLane, can be very helpful, both to you and to the program manager. Okay, just an example now on time frame and supplementary material. Here's an example of.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if we could speed up, we want to make sure we have time for Beth and some questions.
Yep. That's these last couple are going to go very fast. Just wanted to let you know that you do need to obtain a login for the UNOL system if your institution isn't already a UNOLS institution. That can be done, but there's plenty of, the reason why I put this up here, there's places that point you to where you can get further information on vessels and vehicle specifics, who to contact for these weather information and perhaps security. Okay, next. Okay, time frame. This is maybe one of the things you guys wanted to hear about most. Depends on how many investigators. If it's just you, fairly straightforward lab-based proposal. You know, if you plan to have an equivalent of 2 full weeks during the month before submittal, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape if it's a first-time proposal. If it's a revised proposal, you might actually be able to do a rather good job with 1 full week sometime during the month, you know, spread over the month before submittal. If you've got 2 co-investigators or more, how long it's going to take probably depends on who they are. If they're people you've worked with before, you're probably going to need a good 3 to 4 weeks. If they're people you've never worked with before, you're going to need a bit more time because you guys are going to be learning how to talk with each other and finding out, okay, who actually makes it on time versus who typically is a week later than what they thought they could do because they're very busy. And so, you know, an additional 3 to 4 weeks if you're in that latter situation. How complex is the experimental work that you're planning? You'll need to, you may not need to include it in the proposal, but for you guys as early career, it's might be a good idea to go ahead, and you'll definitely want to work up a detailed work plan. And this lets you know that in fact what you've kind of waved your arm about that you want to do, that it physically can be done in a reasonable amount of time. And for a seagoing proposal, that would entail doing a daily plan. You know, which activities are going to happen in a day? Do you have day operations? Do you have different night operations? And how that's going to hand off, and who the people that are going to be out at sea might actually be able, what kind of watches would they have to stand? Is that possible? You can't have people staying up for 8 weeks in a row. Think about what fallback options that, you know, if your stuff's very straightforward, no big deal. But if it's a project that has some risky aspects to it, that can be very exciting. But you might at least want to think about what fallback options there would be if, while you're out at sea, one of those activities doesn't pan out for whatever reason. You may or may not want to include that in the proposal. Often you don't need to, but it's a good thing to discuss ahead of time and to prepare for. Perhaps you want to bring something else out with you and you need to ship that. Okay, and then again, as we've talked about before, if there's interdependencies of some later work on earlier findings, make sure you've worked out the timing of that. And then finally on the timing, if this is something that's pretty new to you, my experience is your thinking evolves quite a bit as you go along. And if you're really dead set on submitting on a particular date, I would back up the beginning of work, you know, 4 to 6 months from that beginning date. Because at least my experience is your thoughts evolve, and that's a good thing. That's part of the process. Okay, I think we just have one more. Communications. I think I've touched on most of this, but I guess maybe just this first bullet is, it's really important for you as the lead PI of a team. You're the one that sets the tone. Be inviting enough to other people's ideas, but don't let things go too far afield because you're going to have to bring them back together to some realizable plan. And I've already mentioned, you're going to have different parts of your team are going to have different strengths. Try to set up your framework in a way that takes advantage of that. You know, it's most useful to you put a straw man framework out there, get some feedback on that, update it, and then you do the assigning of filling in the details and getting leads of section writers and things like that. It can be frustrating, but if you've got somebody you really want on the team and they're just not good at writing things or not writing to a deadline, go ahead and draft their section in perhaps a very rough way and give them a certain date to give you some feedback on that draft. And sometimes that can help move things forward. Give them something to respond to. Some people work better that way. Okay, I think we now are on the last slide. I've pretty much said all this. So I guess a point that I'd like to make here, and it was a communications specialist that keyed me into this phrasing of inverted pyramid. start with what you're going to do and why you're going to do it and what the outcomes are. Put that right up front. Then build that scientific context. Then get into the details of the processing and analyses methods. Recap how those methods are going to actually allow you to answer that first question. Then kind of a later stage is to go through the work plan, details of who, what, when, and then come back at the very end of your project description and remind people, okay, going through these steps in these orders with these products or deliverables, this is how we get back to our main question. And I'll leave it there.
As Kristen is setting up Beth, I will introduce her. Our second speaker is Beth Orcutt. She's a senior research scientist at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences and also a C-DEBI senior scientist. Her research focuses on geomicrobiology and biogeochemistry to examine life below the seafloor. She has a BS from University of Georgia and a PhD from the University of Georgia. With that, I will turn it over to Beth.
Great. So thank you very much, Donna, for giving us an idea of how one scopes a proposal. What I want to focus on now is how do you construct your budget, what goes in it, how do you plan for it, and I'm going to focus specifically on the NSF format because it's what I'm most familiar with, but many agencies kind of follow a similar approach, and you would follow a similar approach to put them together. So next slide, please. So before you begin, and if you're a new faculty at a university, if you're starting a new job, or even if you're a postdoc at a program and you're interested in getting involved in grant management, I cannot stress enough how important it is to get to know the person in your sponsored project office who will be your grant manager. So the money is not given to you directly, it is given to your institution, and they have an agreement, a negotiated agreement to manage that money. And so your grant manager is your pipeline to make sure your project gets submitted. They often have templates to help you prepare your budgets and justifications, language that you can use. They will also tell you what the institution's deadlines are for submitting your budget for approval by your institution before it can be submitted. So you can't work right up to the deadline and be like, okay, I'm ready. Most program offices will laugh at you. So really get to know them and find out when the deadlines are for submitting things for approval. And they will be going through your budget. Make sure you're not proposing to do something that is illegal, that you're not proposing to do something that is not allowable by the granting agency, and also just they can check to make sure that you put in this dollar amount here, but you justified it a different amount here. So they are your friends, get to know them. You also want to start out by thinking, how much can you ask for? And what is the average size of an award that your agency is it could be offered? One way to look this up is by going to the specific program announcement. Donna mentioned that. So for instance, with NSF, you would go to nsf.gov award search. And you can look for what are the size of grants that have recently been funded. So if you go to the next slide. There we go. This is just an example screenshot. I apologize to whoever this principal investigator is that I'm using as an example totally randomly. But this is to show you what this award search page looks like. So for example, I started on the NSF web page for the oceanography program, the biological oceanography section. And I said, there's a link on there that says, what is this program recently funded? So I clicked on that link and it brought me to this page. And that's this element code there that's for biological oceanography. But you could also do your own search by going to, for instance, the simple search or the advanced search tabs and typing in earthquakes or the name of a PI or anything like that. And it will bring up a list of what has recently been funded. And it'll show you the name of the principal investigator. It will show you the award size. And if you were to click on one of those links, so next slide, please. it will bring you to, for instance, the project page. It'll say, this is who was funded, this is when the project starts, this is how much money they got. If you were to scroll down on the page, it would also give you the project abstract. And so you can do some simple math here and figure out, okay, they got award for 3 years, they got $360,000, that's roughly $120,000 a year or something like that. So next slide, please. So in my experience as both a writer and a reviewer of proposals, I've kind of found as a rule of thumb that about 100 to 150K total, so direct plus indirect, per year PI is kind of typical for a 3-year project. And that amount of money, people propose to use it in different ways, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it typically can cover the cost for having a student or a postdoc, maybe some of the PI salary, and the other things that are needed for this project. So that's kind of a ballpark estimate. But this is a value that you want to tweak sometimes. Maybe you want to go with, for instance, maybe a program manager has a little bit of money left over in a program. If your budget comes in on the smaller side, sometimes your project looks more attractive because they can actually fund it. So this is, again, something that's good to discuss with your program manager, and Donna mentioned this. And what I recommend is if you have a really cool idea, do some back of the envelope calculations about what you think it's going to entail, a simple pitch, and contact your program manager just to get their idea about the feasibility of this. Next slide, please. So as I just said, you need to kind of figure out what you need to get the project done, and then you need to be prepared to generate both a yearly and a cumulative budget. You're going to need to follow the template that NSF requests, and often, again, your institution will have a template to help you do that. And then you're also going to need to prepare a budget justification, a written document that justifies why you need the amount of money that you need. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but if your project includes subawards, they have to have their own budget justification. I forgot to mention that on every single slide here, you're seeing at the top this gray box that says proposal guidelines. I cannot stress enough how useful it is to go review that, because it will have all of the details of what you can and cannot do and what you need. So make sure to visit that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you a bit about the different categories, what goes in them, to help you think about how you frame your budget. So the very first set of categories in NSF budgets is related to salaries and wages. And there are different categories within that. There's a category for senior personnel. These are typically like the faculty level type PIs. And for most institutions, you cannot have more than 2 months, I don't know why I put 2/months per year, but 2 months per year from all of your combined NSF sources. There are exceptions to that for some types of institutions, like research institutions, but you would have to have an agreement with that federal agency for that. So often you're not putting in a lot of time. If you're a faculty member, often you have time budgeted into your faculty appointment. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's a line where you can request administrative or clerical. This is not very commonly included, and it's only included if it's really specific and integral to the project, and you probably should talk to your program manager about whether your category fits. You might want to request support for a postdoc. So postdocs, you can request their full salary here. There are some institutions that allow postdocs to be listed as co-PIs, but it's important to note that if you are listed as a co-PI, you cannot request that full 12 months of salary. So this is a negotiation that you need to discuss with your supervisor. And then students, if they are paid a salary, that line would go in this section as well. Then there'll be a following section, line C, which is for estimating the fringe benefits that go along with your salary. These are things like the holiday and sick leave, retirement, all the things that your institution offers as benefits. Your institution will be able to provide that information for you. And sometimes there's different rates for different types of employees. And that's where those templates come in really handy. At the bottom here, I've mentioned that these two categories often make up the largest fraction of the budget, is to pay people to do the work. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. All right, line D on the NSF budget category is for equipment. So if there is equipment that is absolutely essential for this work that you do not have, you can make a pitch to try to get NSF to help you fund that equipment. And that's defined as anything that has a lifetime more than a year and that costs more than $5,000. And that cost can include things like the modifications, accessories, et cetera, to make it a functional piece of equipment. I often find that seeing a quote from a possible vendor is helpful for justifying the amount of money that you're requesting. The next line would be related to travel. And so you would need here to justify what travel is required for this project to work. Is there field work that needs to go on? Are there meetings and conferences that you need to go to? I wanted to point out here that NSF does specify in the grant proposal guidelines that you can also include in this category if there's funding required for temporary dependent care that you would need to pay for to participate in these things. You can visit the NSF website for more information about that. So typically you're justifying things like the airfare to get to where you need to go, how many people are going, what the transportation costs are, et cetera. And I recommend to folks that you might want to visit the U.S. General Services Administration website, which is a great place to start to find these per diem rates. What is the federal government willing to pay for you to stay in a hotel in this city, et cetera, and how much they think meals are going to cost if you go to that city. So that's a good place to start to get that information. Next slide, please. In some cases, you may include a section called participant support. This is for things where you're doing some kind of event or some type of activity within your project where there are going to be participants that are not employees. So for instance, if you're holding a workshop, if you have a bunch of summer interns that are not employees, et cetera. And so there's a specific section here where you justify what the costs are for having those participants as part of your project. So then the big section that everybody really thinks about is this other direct cost section. And that's where all the materials and supplies that you need for your project, there's a line for that. How much it's going to cost you to release the information that you've generated, publication costs, there are other types of dissemination costs, there's a line for that. There's another line related to consultant services. So this is, for instance, if you need to hire professional services by non-employees. So you can look up that specific category and what falls in there. There is a special category as well for computer services. I would say that this is very rarely included, and there are very strict guidelines for what counts as computer services, where you would have that as a separate line item. So look at the grant proposal guideline for that section. Oftentimes things related to computers are included in materials and supplies. If you're going to have sub-awards as part of your contract, your proposal, there's a separate section for that. And then other is all kinds of other things that don't really have their own category. Things like shipping, postage, tuition for students, equipment maintenance. All of those things kind of fall under this bundled other category. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about how you construct the justification. So next slide, please. So your final, kind of the end of your budget, you add up all of those direct costs, everything that you've just put together. That's your line H, direct costs. And then your institution is going to have a federally negotiated rate to cover facilities and administrative costs, things like keeping the lights on in the building and the parking lot clean and all those other things that allow you to do the work that you do. There's an institution rate that will then apply to these direct costs. And every institution has a different way of calculating those that have been approved in their federally negotiated rates. So you just need to get this information from your grants manager to help you figure out what that number is, and then you add all that up together, and that's your total. Some proposals also discuss matching funds. I am not going to go into that in this talk because it's too complicated, but again, visit that grant proposal guideline if you find a situation where you're applying for a grant that requires matching funds. Next slide, please. All right, so here is an example template. This is what the budget looks like when you get an NSF proposal. So all those various categories here you can see on the left-hand side. Section A about wages, Section B about wages for other non-senior PIs, et cetera, working your way down. And so when you prepare your budget, you will have one of these pages for each year, and then there will be a cumulative budget of all of those years together. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like in the NSF proposal. And again, your grants office will likely have a template to help you calculate the numbers that go in here. Next slide, please. All right, so how do you then prepare your justification? What information are you including in this written document? Generally, I find that it's kind of organized in the same way, going through the different sections that are in the proposal. And so you would say, for instance, under a senior personnel category, you know, PI so-and-so is requesting this much time, and it's going to cover this type of participation. Similarly, for the other personnel that you're involved, you would justify, you know, I'm requesting 3 months for my technician and that person will do this, or I'm requesting 2 years for my postdoc and they will have these responsibilities. You would have a section explaining the fringe benefits section. If you're requesting equipment, you would have a justification in here for why you're requesting the amount of money that you have. So is it $20,000? Is it $50,000? Is it $6,000? Where are you getting this estimate from? And again, a supplemental document showing a quote could be helpful for that. Next slide. You'll want to have a section explaining the travel that you're proposing. So we need to go here. This many people need to go there. This is how much on average it's going to cost to get there. And what the justification is for that. If you're going to have a participant support section, you would justify what that support is and where you came up with those numbers. Next slide. A lot of the justification goes into this other direct cost section because there are so many subcategories. So for your materials and supplies, I've seen this done many different ways. Some people say, you know, on average, it costs $300 per month for consumables and supplies in my laboratory, and that will cover this. I've also seen it much more specific, like I need this much for reagents, I need this much for plastic, I need this much, etc. Or I need 3 hours of time on this instrument and it costs this much money. Your grants office can probably give you guidance for your department of what is a common way to do that. So I suggest talking to your grants manager about that. You want to specify why you're requesting money for publication costs. If there's a particular journal that you're going after where you think your work will be published and how much that's going to cost. If you're, again, subawards are complicated, so if you're going down that route, definitely talk to your sponsored project office about the best way to go about that, because they oftentimes have specific deadlines or requirements for getting the documentation for that. If you're at an institution that's students, you would include their tuition. If you need to ship samples around, you might include that here. I highlighted this part about ship time. Typically, if you were requesting a UNOLS vessel within the oceanography program, you put in a supplemental ship time request, but you do not put the money that's required for that ship in your budget. However, if you are going to be chartering a specific vessel, let's say you're going to charter a lobster boat to go help you do your research, you need to include that in your budget, and this is the place that you would do it. And so that's just an example where you could just go through and explain what these other categories are that are required for your research. Next slide.
Beth, can I cut in for a second?
Yeah.
As we're seeing, obviously we could spend days talking about budget management. So I thank everyone for joining in. If you have to leave right now, as we mentioned, this will be recorded, so you can watch it at a later time. If you're able to stay, we will have a Q&A session and for both Beth and Donna. Thank you. Back to you, Beth.
Yeah, and this is my last slide.
Okay, great.
So that was really a quick and dirty about how to generate an NSF proposal budget. And just to reemphasize again, get to know your grants manager. They will help you with this process. I did want to mention that there are other agencies out there. So often they have similar categories, but they might have a different way of calling them or in a different order. So again, ask your grants manager if they have a template to help you prepare for those other agencies. I did want to mention, so often for NSF proposals, you're putting in your time in like weeks or months or something, but other agencies like NASA, for example, want you to put in what's called a full-time equivalent. And I've had several people ask me, what is that? And so just imagine if you said, I'm going to work on this 1 day per week of my normal work week. You know, that would be 8 hours divided by 40 hours, 0.2% full-time equivalent. That's essentially what that is. You may also have an interest in applying for private foundations. Typically, private foundations have much smaller caps on what they are willing to pay for the facilities and administrative costs. And so in that case, you need to get permission from your sponsored project office to submit proposals like that, because you're getting less indirect than they have federally negotiated. And so it's just a little bit more of an involved process to get that permission, but I just wanted to point that out. And so I believe that is my last slide. Someone else is controlling this for me. Yes, there we go. And so I guess, how do we want to handle questions here?
Yeah, well, we already have one question in the chat, so we can start there. It's for Beth. When it comes to applying for money that could be used for support supplies and research as part of a research-based class, should it be included in line F, even if it's more a long-term part of the project?
Yeah, this is a good question, Emily and Rosa. So for example, here at my institution, we run a summer program for interns. And the way that we do that is we use the participant support section, line F, to really describe what is needed to support the participants. Their subsistence costs, their travel costs, so that they can be part of the program. But materials and supplies that they need to be involved in whatever the project is, that should go under your materials and supplies section, because it's not really to help the participants be there, but it's more for a research type project. And so we kind of split that up into two sections. At my institution, it's kind of how we do it. Hopefully that helped answer your question. Okay. Next question here. 2 questions I'm seeing here from Jesse. Is it common to be awarded less than requested in the proposal? And the second part is, can postdocs act as lead PIs? Maybe I'll take a stab at this, and Donna, you can chime in as well. The program manager sometimes will contact you and say, you know, I can offer you this much, you know, can you still do the project with that much money? It varies by agency how frequently that happens. I don't know if there's been a study on how frequent that is. It does happen. I wouldn't say it's super, super common, because often it changes the scope of the project to change it. And so then the program's not really funding the project that was proposed. It can happen, but not very frequently in my experience. As to your, yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Just while we're on that question, I think it does vary with program in NSF a little bit, and as you said, between different agencies as well. On the NSF side, you know, that sometimes it's just a matter that a program manager has, you know, is really close to being able to fund a set of things. And if just trimming, you know, maybe 3 of those budgets 10%, they could get that work to go forward. They might just ask for an across the board 10% reduction. And they'll if they're going to propose this to you, it'll be a question, you know, if I could provide 90% of the support, could you do this project? And they will ask you to break it down. Sometimes it'll just be across the board, all categories reduced similarly. Other times there will be, you know, specific areas. I've actually had a proposal myself where the reviewers and the program manager were very happy with the majority of the aspects, but there was one aspect that just didn't review that well. And so they asked us to revise the budget. And then that's a formal step. It actually has to go back through your grants and contracts office again, get reapproved. Because if the budget is more than 10% different than what you submitted initially, it actually has to be a formal revision. But that's a process that sometimes there's very good reasons to do that, and it's just means it's one more step. It's not really a problem. You just have to do it, and you need to do it fairly quickly if it's near the end of the fiscal year, for example. Go ahead, Beth. You had something for the rest of that question.
Yeah, so the second part of Jesse's question here was, can postdocs act as lead PIs? That is a institution by institution decision. Some institutions allow it, others do not. And so that would be something that you have to discuss with your institution. For example, where I work, if the postdoc has been here for over a year and they've had a good rapport, they can discuss doing this with their supervisor and our grants office, but not everywhere does that. And again, there are other stipulations about how much of their salary can then be requested, because they can't just request the full salary.
So on that one, it's something that as you're checking with your institution, don't forget to ask them how long that approval process would take if you are going to seek to get that kind of an approval. Because my institution, it can take a couple months. So you can't do it the week before the thing is going to be submitted.
Sure. Let's see here. We have a question from Katrina Twing about outreach costs. There are maybe a couple places where costs related to doing efforts related to your broader impacts, if you have an outreach component. You may include, if there's materials and supplies related to that, I would include them as other and specify that they're specifically for outreach activities. Similarly, if you need to hire somebody to help you make this happen as a contractor or a consultant, then you may want to include that as some of these other line items under the other direct costs. And there, the grant proposal guideline will help you figure out, should I put them as a consultant or under contracted services? It's kind of where you would want to include costs like that. But if you are requesting costs related to broader impacts, outreach type things, I think you want to be very clear and specific about why those costs are really necessary to help you with the project and your outreach goals. Because remember that many of these agencies are science funding agencies, and so you really want to justify these costs that are really part of making your project connect with the broader impact aspects of your project.
Yeah, I might almost say that even kind of in the opposite sense, at least on the NSF side, and this is just partly because I'm not as familiar with what the outreach desires are for different agencies or different programs within agencies. But broader impacts are one of two criteria. You need to address both criteria in every proposal. And so there's really no reason to think of your outreach costs differently than you think about your science costs. As Beth said, in both cases, for both types of costs, you need to justify it very explicitly. But there's no reason to think that, you know, if you're going to be spending 2 weeks of your time on those outreach activities, well, that's part of the salary that you're requesting. And so you lay it out. I expect my work in the lab is going to take me 4 weeks, and I expect my outreach activities to take 2 weeks. Thus, I've asked for 6 weeks of salary, or whatever I just added up to.
Great. Moving on to the next question here. It looks like this question related to references, the number and the format. I think you'll get different responses on this depending on who you ask. My preference as a reviewer of proposals is I like to see the references by name, not just a number and a bunch of numbers that I have to go look up. Because usually if I'm being asked to review something, I'm being asked to review it because I'm an expert and I would recognize the names and the papers that are being cited. And so it does take more space, but I feel that as a reviewer, it's helpful for me as a reviewer. And so I'm looking for that. I'm also not looking for an exhaustive list of 10 people who've talked about each thing that you're referencing to have a huge reference library, but really that you're pointing to the key papers that are supporting the claim that you're making. And so I wouldn't say that there's a maximum or a minimum number of references to go with a proposal, but really more about tailoring, justifying why you're putting those references there and that you're covering the references that are relevant. Donna, I don't know if you have a different preference there.
No, I think you've covered that just fine.
Yeah. Okay.
This question on ship schedules. It's a good question, Zach. So it's asking how do we know what the ship schedules are? What's the best way to write and manage a proposal if it's contingent on a certain class inside? So I think the probably most general advice on how to find out what a ship schedule might be is start with the UNOLS office. service. They're a service agency, they're people that are paid to basically make this all work. And so I would tend to point people there first. There will be some situations if there's a particular capability and a particular operator, whether it's Woods Hole, Scripps, maybe it's Oregon, if their specific ship is the one that operates that particular capability, whether it's a type of winch or a CTD or something like that. And so then at that stage, you go beyond the general UNOLs and you get in touch with the operators is another way to do it. Those tend to be the most immediate responses. If your project is something that's a little bit unusual in terms of the type of work that NSF has done in the past, Rose DeFore she's the ship scheduling person, and so she can be a very good contact. Again, just for her to kind of protect her time. Most questions you don't need to start with her. In fact, it doesn't make sense. UNOLs can answer them. But in some unusual situations, or you're kind of mulling over a new type of scenario with ships, Rose, I think, can be very helpful. Brian Mitzen at NSF, he is the one who oversees the deep submergence facilities. So if you're looking at some of those specialized vehicles, he can guide you in terms of scheduling. Yes, a given operator might know scheduling for their particular vehicle, but they might not have the overview that Brian Mitzen would have of all the vehicles. And maybe one is going to be available 2 years earlier than the other one. And with a little bit of tweaking your plan, you could actually get the work done with maybe not your first choice, but one that actually could, with a little bit different design, accomplish it. Does that answer your question?
And I'm adding here the web link for UNOLs, for those of you who are not familiar, to kind of get you in the right location. It used to be that the actual schedules were posted on the website, like on this day, going here and this. They've stopped doing that because they were requested to stop doing that for Homeland Security reasons. But this is a good place to get you started and knowing who to contact and the operators and things like that, as Donna was mentioning. Let's see, what are the questions we have here? There's a question here related to how we evaluate proposals as a reviewer in terms of the budget and say, wow, does this look underfunded? So as a reviewer, what I'm looking for is, have they justified to me that what they're doing is super cool and we should fund it? That's question number one. Then I'm looking at the budget and the justification to say, can they actually accomplish this cool thing that they told me that they were going to do? Did they request too much, or did they request not enough? For example, we're going to answer this question and but all we need is 1 week of beam time or something. And I'm thinking, is that enough? I might make those comments in my review of, really cool question, but maybe the budget doesn't match. So it's not necessarily underfunded or overfunded, but does the budget and the justification for what they're doing convince me that they can accomplish what they said they were going to do? So yes, you definitely look at that as a reviewer.
Yeah, as a reviewer. And then just a little bit of insight into what happens next. A reviewer may write that in their review. A panel has a chance to comment on that, and often if it's been brought up in a review, program manager will bring it to the panel and say, do you guys agree with this reviewer? What do you think? Sometimes a program manager during the panel will say, is this something that could be addressed? Maybe it's a simple question, or or just a budget revision. Sometimes that doesn't mean your proposal won't fly, but it can be, and Beth kind of alluded to this. If you're so far off, it's gonna lower the people's confidence in your sort of being aware of what's it going to take to get this done. And then it depends on, how crucial is that particular step that looks underfunded. If it's kind of something on the side and you've low budgeted yourself, actually a program manager can come back and say, you need to budget more. And they can do that. It would mean a budget revision most times. But it's one of those, it's kind of a matter of scale as to how far off. Always try to be as close as you can. And sometimes it'll mean, occasionally what I've seen happen is advice to bring on an additional collaborator who could cover one aspect and help a relatively new team make things work. So, sometimes you actually get good feedback between a first submittal and a revised proposal.
Yeah. So it looks like there's a question here about guidance on whether it makes sense to go on your own first and start something small, or to try to be part of a team and a bigger thing. It's a really great question. I think there are different approaches depending on who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. There are advantages to trying to go out on your own, but what you need to be careful of there and what you need to build into your support network is asking colleagues who are senior to you to help look at your proposal and give you feedback. If you're going out on it on your own, there's going to be things that you're maybe not thinking about. And so developing a mentor network and saying, I'm going to try to aim for this proposal call. I'm going to write this proposal by myself. I've got this really great idea. I think I can do it all by myself. Would you be willing to look at this 2 weeks ahead of time and give me some feedback? It may be a good way to go. However, if there are other projects that you feel like the question that you are really excited about really requires collaborators, then maybe it does make sense to reach out to other people and try to be involved in a collaborative project. But as Donna said, this takes more time, it's more complicated. There are some cases where, as a junior person, you may want to associate with colleagues that you've developed over time, maybe your former advisor, et cetera, but you also want to be mindful of, especially if you're at a university, the evaluation of you as a scientist and really showing that these ideas are your own. And so that's something that is careful to protect at the beginning stages of writing as an early career person. So those are the things that you want to juggle in terms of how you want to decide if it makes sense to go with your idea all by yourself, or if your idea really requires collaborators to make it happen and make it a bigger part than it would be just on your own to decide how to do that.
Thanks.
An interesting twist that is kind of related to that. And, you know, I'm just mentioning it just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of just kind of how these things evolve sometimes in our community, which is, you know, we're a good sized community, but we're not a giant community in the marine geosciences. And it's that when the majority of your work is collaborative, and in fact you collaborate with a variety of different types of groups, what that means, and it can be a very great thing, it can mean huge productivity, means that you're conflicted in the formal sense with a lot of the community. And so then when you submit proposals, those people are not allowed to review your proposals. And so I wouldn't say, you know, do the science that you want to do. But if it's a case where you're kind of thinking, wait, should I formally bring this person in as a collaborator? Or should I just be fine with getting on the phone to them now or then, or chatting with them for an hour when I see them at a conference about this particular topic? And then you're not writing papers with them, you're not formally linked to them on a proposal, then they can, if they're objective people, still give a good objective review of your proposal. And if you're in a field where there's a very small number of experts in the field, sometimes that actually can be very helpful. It's, you know, we certainly found there's certain communities where, you know, it's hard to get knowledgeable reviewers because everybody works together and there's only 6 of them in the country, you know. And so it does start to come into play. It's kind of an interesting twist that I don't think I'd fully realized until I had seen it at NSF, and trying to select reviewers and really get the input that you need. And this feeds into actually the next question. I think that's, if I haven't skipped.
We're going to need to stop.
Oh, okay.
Way over time, and that seemed like a good question to end on. So
okay.
Sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but thank you for joining us. And again, we will post the recording of this, and we'll send an email to let everyone know where that is. And I know there was a question earlier about whether or not we could also provide the slides separately, and we will talk to the presenters about that. And if we're able to, we'll send that with the recording info. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to our speakers. Thanks, Donna. Thanks, Beth.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.